Hello. The unit I shall demonstrate today is this straight, slim skirt you see here on the form. This skirt is considered a basic pattern as well as the bodice. This bodice too is the basic pattern. Because it is a close body fitting, it's considered a foundation pattern for the development of many other styles in a pattern making procedure, and is a sloper tool used by pattern makers and designers alike. However, designers use this pattern just as it is as part of classic styling in the same way that they would use the bodice that is attached to it. As a total dress unit, this is considered a sheath type dress, although there is a seam at the waistline. And both these patterns are a set of sloper patterns in pattern making development. Notice that the balance of the cross grain is maintained at the hip as it is at the bodice. There are two dots, however, in the front skirt, while there's only one dart at the bodice. There are two darts at the back skirt, while there's only one dart at the bodice. Notice again, however, that the darts at princess position on bodice and skirt line up in the back as well as the front. When these patterns are being used as a dress, it is important that the two darts be lined up. Now, in developing the pattern for the skirt, we have to identify the widest point of the hip, as that location is the control point for the appropriate balance and fit of the skirt. The length of the skirt is a variable. Okay, let's go to the body. And locate the widest point of the hip by measuring from center front around to center back. On the average, the 7-inch level has been found to be a good wide point location. However, many times the 9-inch level proves to be wider because it involves the buttock area of the body. Because of that, most pattern makers, and we do here, prefer to use the 9-inch level as our location for the cross grain. So let's identify that 9-inch level at the center front and sink a pin at that 9-inch level. Starting at center front, measure around the body to center back. That measures out at about 18.5. But we want to be able to measure at a point that is parallel to the floor. And so when we drape, we know exactly where to place the muslin. One of the ways to help you determine that is to measure from one of the ribs up at front and continue to measure at intervals from that same cross rib all the way around the body. Another way to do it is to bring the figure down to the level of the table so that the position pin rests at the top of the table. And using the table as your guide, sink pins at intervals to help you get the parallel position accurately. I'm not sinking it yet. I think I lost one. Yes, I lost one. Okay. Having identified the level, we can now sink the pins, slipping it right under the muslin casing. At this point, you can then add black tape at the levels of the pins to define your widest point area a little more. For the purpose of this demonstration, however, we will just use those pins as a guide as is. Having identified this hip level, we want to now measure out the block of muslin that you need for your draping. And for one moment, I return to the original figure to make note of the fact that this skirt has a front and a back separated with a seam at the side. Some skirts can be developed with no seam and all in one. We will develop a two-section pattern. However, for our initial muslin blocking, we will measure out the complete block all in one. We will want to measure the body for length and for cross. For length, we will use a determined length. The length of the skirt will vary based on season, style variations, and also the particular person, if you're doing custom dressmaking, for the particular person that you may be developing the garment for. However, let's use the length of skirt at 30 inches for a hypothetical numeral, and we will then add 2 inches for work above the waist and 2 inches for the hem below the finished hem level. The hem of a straight skirt on the average is about 2 inches. It'll vary, sometimes 1.5 inches. And so we now have 32 and 2 more below the hem is 34 lengthwise. For the width, measure center front all the way to center back. This measures out at 18.5, and add 5 inches to that for an overall round number of work muslin. This includes margin, seam allowance, margin, and ease as well. Having blocked out your muslin for length and width, we will now press in to check balance of grains. Once your muslin is blocked, you're ready to mark. And when we mark, we will start at center front, draw in the lengthwise grain 1 inch from the edge, identify location of waistline with a cross mark at the waistline level, 2 inches down from the top. Then we want to know the level of the hip line, 9 inches down from the waistline. And we will draw a cross grain all the way across the muslin from the center front across. Draw in the lengthwise grain, 1 inch from the edge. 2 inches down from the top, waistline cross mark. 9 inches down from the cross mark, hip level. Come back to the very top to give you the measure of your hip level from the top edge of the muslin. And make small notations across the muslin to help you draw the cross grain accurately. Cross mark at waistline, hip line, across muslin, along cross grain. Now we would also like to know where the side seam is, because ultimately we will separate the back from the front from this total block. At center front, at widest point, measure around to the side seam. Okay. And when you measure, measure to the outside of the seam line. Okay. It measures out at 9 1/4. We want to add to this close body measure enough ease for comfort. We add 1/4 inch for ease. So the total measure will be 9 1/4 plus 1/4, 9 1/2. At the hip line, from center front, measure over 9 1/2, and at that point, place a cross mark. That will be the location of your side seam, which will follow the lengthwise grain from the top of the muslin all the way down to the bottom. In order to get an accurate lengthwise grain through the measuring method, let's come back to the outer edge of the muslin, identify the total measurement, 9 1/2, 10 1/2, and mark in your lengthwise grain. This is your side seam. There is another location we would like to draw for help in draping in balance, and that is to measure from the side seam that you just drew back towards the center 2 inches along the cross grain. Okay. At that point, we will draw a lengthwise grain coming up to the top of the muslin only. Okay. The preliminary marking of the front skirt has been completed. Now we are going to add 1 inch beyond the side seam for seam allowance, and then we will cut away and separate the front from the rest of the muslin. Having separated it, we can now proceed to mark the back. But before we do, let's pull away threads that are hanging off in portions on both sections. In that way, when you start measuring at this cut edge, you will have an accurate, continuous lengthwise grain. Now, just to reinforce the relationship of the panels, note that on the cut edges, right, we are locating ourselves at the side seam along these cut edges. Okay? We therefore want to draw the comparable side seam line for the back section. It's the front, the back. Measure 1 inch from the edge. Draw along the lengthwise grain, and you have now drawn in the equivalent side seam on the back section. Additionally, we would like to draw in a guideline on the back in the upper portion of the hip, 2 inches from the side seam. In this case, moving towards the center back from the side seam. All right, we've completed with the comparable markings at the side seam area. The last, but certainly not the least, notation is the center back seam location. In order to know where the center back seam is, we have to know what the measurement is from the side of the body in the back to the center. Once again, starting at the outer side of the seam, along the widest point, measure the back. It's 9 3/8. Add 1/4 of an inch for ease. It was 9 5/8. Set the front aside for now, and working at the hip from the side seam, measure over to identify the center back seam with a cross mark. Let's just check the measurement again to make sure that it's correct. Okay, 9 5/8. Okay, once we know exactly where it is, we want to draw the grain line all the way along the lengthwise grain. Since this cross mark is closer to the lengthwise grain at the opposite end, we can use that location as a guide for our measuring notations. Now, the extra muslin that we have was within the extra inches that we added when we were blocking out in a general context. We don't need more than 1 inch margin. If you had 1.5 inches, that would be fine. But when you have as much as all that, it is advisable to cut away the extra. And again, having cut, we want to pull until we come up with one long continuous thread. At this point, we have now completed the marking of the front and the back sections and are prepared to drape.
Am I in? Yes, you're in. Am I in? Right there. That's where you should be. Okay. Standing by. Stand by.
We are now ready to drape the skirt. Put the back panel aside for now. And we'll drape the front. Turn seam allowance under. Begin at the waistline and secure down to the bottom of the torso. Pin at lower hip, pin at upper hip. Okay. At this point, we set the foundation of the skirt, which is at the hip level and entails bringing the cross grain into balance parallel to the floor. Okay. Remember, you did put pins at parallel positions, and you can feel those pins through the muslin to help you set the grain into balance. Smooth the muslin across the body, close to the body initially. When the grain is in balance, the cross grain parallel to the floor and the length grain perpendicular to the floor, you can then shift the side seam grain line into position so that it touches the side seam of the figure. You are shifting the ease which you placed in the preparation previously. You're shifting that ease into the body area. Having done so, secure at the side seam to keep the cross grain and the length grain into balance. Hold the length grain down at the bottom of the torso to keep the perpendicular position. The ease being distributed at this point is not secured appropriately for further draping. We don't want it shifted out of place. At this point, distribute the ease and secure at intervals around the body at hip level Sometimes it's necessary to bring the figure up a little higher so you can get a better perspective of the grain position. Okay. Once placing into position, place a double row of pins. No, this is shifting out. It's dropping. When you get this bubble, it means the grain is dropping at center. You see? That's a diagonal and an imbalance. This is time-consuming sometimes, but important. Okay. Having secured the cross and the length, you've completed the draping of the lower skirt. Now we will turn to the upper skirt. Starting at the grain line, 2 inches from the side seam at hip level, bring that grain line up, straight up over the hip. In order to do that, you have to lower the figure once more. All right. When in position, pick up a pinch at the waistline tape and then secure to the body. Move to the side seam and drape the upper hip from the cross grain at the hip level up to the waistline at the tape. Bring your finger so that it is smoothing the muslin against the body along the seam line to the waistline tape. We want to be sure. If any ease is pushing itself into that area, smooth it away. We want to be sure that there is no ripple or gap in the area of that hip from the seam line towards the back. Pin at tape. If in doing so you find a little extra fullness requires to be shifted over, we will allow it to remain in the waistline area, adjust it if necessary. If it's more than pushing over can contain, you could take up another tiny pinch. What happens here is dependent on the curve of the hip. The more curved the hip is at that point, the more adjustment might have to be made at that portion of the waistline. We must make sure, however, that the fit of the skirt is contained within the area from the seam to the front of the body, that there is no extra ease beyond that seam line. Having finished the fitting over the hip, we are now ready to fit the body in the area from center front to the side seam position. And this take-up that you see here is what's going to be worked into the 2-dart sloper development. Rather than taking it up all in one area, we want to divide the pickup so that part of it will fall within the princess line area and part of it will fall halfway between the princess line and the side seam. I say princess line for the first dart. However, that may be variable depending on whether this skirt will be attached to the bodice or not. If the skirt is attached to the bodice, the position of that first dart will be at the same point as the waist dart on the bodice. I have the bodice here, and if we are to work this skirt to match the bodice, we want to know what the distance is. The distance on this bodice is 2 3/4. Measure from the center front to 2 3/4 point and mark it and leave the pin there to act as a position location. The distance between the first dart, which we'll refer to as the princess dart, and the second dart, which is just the dart between princess and side seam, we want to find that center position and mark it. Okay. We can divide the 3 7/8 measurement in half numerically, arithmetically. However, we can also do it by folding the tape in half and using the fold point as the midpoint. That's a mechanical way of achieving the same thing. Place the pin and then mark it. Okay. You now have the two positions identified. Dart 1, dart 2. And at this point now, we want to hold the total pickup up in between the two pins and separate and divide the pickup so that part of it will go towards the first position pin at princess and part of it will go towards the second position pin at midpoint of side panel. In order to help us divide this in a way that will give us a good fit over the hip, find the midpoint down at the hip area and locate the lengthwise grain at that midpoint. Follow that lengthwise grain up towards the waistline, bringing it straight up towards the waistline. Then secure it in between the two darts at waistline tape to hold into position. Okay? Now, at this point, shift the fullness on one side over to position pin and shift it so that it stops precisely at the pin. The pin will not allow it to go further. Having done that, crease on the fold. Do the same thing to the other dart, pushing the fullness over until the position pin stops you. Crease on the fold. Then, from that point, if things look like they're going well, if there is no diagonal pull in either direction, we can proceed to the next step, which is to fold from the waistline down to the lower portion of the dart in the vanishing point area along the lengthwise grain. I lost the pin. Okay. Put another one in there. Okay. This procedure is a second checkpoint. Once having creased along the grain down towards the vanishing point of the dart. We then have a better way of checking the accuracy of how much pickup deserves to be in one position as against another. For instance, if this division were not appropriate to the shape of the figure, if you had placed perhaps more into that area, you would find diagonal strains. If you did the same thing in the other direction, you will find diagonal strains. Now you'll find that quickly. Sometimes it's not quite so apparent, and the creasing procedure is a second checkpoint procedure. Okay. Once having achieved this point, we now want to pin through to hold the pickup with the one position pin. Okay. It looks a little tight. Perhaps I took it up too tightly. A thread or two sometimes makes a big difference. If there's any adjustment, can be made right on the form. Okay. Now you'll notice that the amount of pickup on this dart near the princess line is smaller than the amount of pickup in the dart in between princess and side seam. Okay. The amount of pickup is sometimes equal and sometimes not equal. That amount will be determined by the shape of the figure. You'll notice that the shape of the figure is flatter towards the center of the body than towards the side of the body. And because of the difference in the contour of the body at different locations, the result of shaping, in darting particularly, becomes a variable. The same variable will occur in how long the dart will be. Because of the different contour at the different areas of the body, you'll find that the dart may be equal in length, or you'll find perhaps that one dart may be a little longer than the other. If there is any flexibility, it's preferred to keep the darts equal. However, if the body does demand the difference, we go with the demand of the body. Let's identify at this point what the vanishing point of the darts would be. Smooth against the body and tentatively shift the ease that is occurring in the lower portion of the skirt, shift it away, and in that way you can get a truer estimate of the body demand. Okay. It seems that the dart disappears somewhere around here. Well, it could be a little shorter even, perhaps just a shade higher. All right? Do the same thing to the other dart. Okay. It seems that the two darts could be of equal length. The pickup is not, but the length could be so. Having determined the vanishing point of the dart, you've now completed the draping of the front skirt. and we're ready for marking. The marking starts at the hip line and works up towards the waistline and across to center. From the hip line down, there is no additional marking. We've already done that on the table. It follows the lengthwise grain. From the hip line up, we will mark along the outer edge of the hip seam. Cross mark at waistline side seam intersect. Dot along tape to dart, cross mark each side of the dart. Be sure to mark right on the pin. Cross mark, dot in between darts, come to the next and cross mark each side of the dart. Dot halfway to center and then cross mark center, but in this case the cross mark has previously been determined. Okay, we have now marked the skirt. We're ready to remove it from the form for the truing process. Remove all pins except the dart pins. Lay the skirt on the table. Check the accuracy of your markings. You might have made an adjustment on the form. You might have more than one mark. Make sure that you identify the final mark. Then open your pin, take your pins out, open your darts, and make a very light notation to identify the vanishing point of your dart. Now, we will true our darts first. Notice, again, the pickup of the first dart is quite a bit smaller than the pickup of the second. We want to find the center of each dart at the waistline level so that we may draw a lengthwise grain down to meet the vanishing point and develop a symmetrical dart. Let's see now. All right. Once having found the center of the darts, come back to the outer edge and use it as a guide to identify lengthwise grain. Cross mark at vanishing point. Draw your lengthwise grain and proceed to the next dart. Okay, we are making each dot at the same level. Find the cross grain, follow over from one to the other, cross mark at vanishing point, and draw the grain line. Having found the grain line, we're now ready to draw the dart on either side. The darts in the front are short, and the reason they are short is because the body curves according to the hip bone. The hip bone is somewhere around 4 inches, 3.5 to 4 inches from the waistline. That's an average measurement. We're not using measurements here. It's just a guide for you. Based on the contour of the body and looking at the silhouette of the body, you can see that the dart really should be curved to accommodate the curve. The dart should be curved to accommodate the contour of the body. So what we do is we use the straighter part of the French curve, starting at the tip, using the tip and placing it at the vanishing point of the dart. We draw in each side of our dart. Just to give you some inkling of the relationship of the curve to the body, you see, you can see the curve of this French curve does have a direct relationship to the curve of the body at this point. The tip of the French curve connecting to the waistline intersect. Okay? Flip the curve over and draw the same line to complete your dart. The same thing on the other dart. Flip the curve over. And draw the other side. We've now trued the 2 darts, and it's completed. The last thing we want to true is the side seam from the hip up. Now, if you take a close look at the dots that have been noted to reflect the seam line, you'll see that the dots sort of dip in at one point of the hip. But in truth, the hip does not necessarily dip in. The hip curves gradually in a smooth, continuous line. So these dots should be used as a guide for general direction. And what you will do is you will use your hip curve and shift the hip curve, adjusting it until the contour of the curve reflects the general contour of the upper hip. And so that the line that you get when you make the transition from the straight grain at lower hip to the curve of the upper hip is a smooth, continuous transition. In doing this, you'll find at times that the hip curve will not touch every single dot that you've made. However, the curve itself is relatively true to the direction that you've noted. We've now completed the truing of the front and can go on to the next step. To prepare the back for draping, we will trace off the side seam that you've trued on the front section onto the equivalent position of the side panel. In this way, we'll guarantee that both side seams on the front and the back are shaped exactly the same way and therefore retain the symmetry in developing skirts for use with plaids and stripes. Bring your panels together with the side edges parallel to each other. Then pick them up and pin them together, lining up the length and the cross to each other in this manner. Having secured the grains so that they don't slip from position, we will trace the upper hip area from cross grain to waistline cross mark at waistline. We've now duplicated the shape of the front side panel onto the back side panel and developed the back side seam completely. While it's still pinned, mark off the 1-inch seam allowance from the hip line up to the waistline, following the contour of the new side seam, and trim away the excess muslin. Take note of the difference between the shape of the hip from the grain line at the hip up to the waistline compared to the continuation of the lengthwise grain coming up from the hip to the waistline. The side seam moves away from the lengthwise grain from the hip as you move to the waistline. Separate the panels. Lay them side by side. Turn under the seam allowance of the front. Pin the front to the back while it is on the flat. When pinning along straight, like the lower portion of the skirt is, you may pin at wider intervals. In the curve area of upper hip, the pinning may be closer for better control. Once having pinned the back to the front at the side seam, we are now ready to continue draping, placing the removing pins. Remove all pins, all pinch pins. Okay. Little marks at the vanishing point. Once again, find the center of the darts. Draw down at that center to identify length grain. Check the length of the dart once more. Cross mark at the length determined. Okay. Connect to each side for a straight-sided dart. This was not done exactly right. This is the center. Notice. We want to remark center, which means we remark the grain line and which shifts the dart a little bit. Well, when that happens, it is wise to use another color to avoid confusion. And so we use another color and correct the markings. Fold to close the darts. Now, once we close these darts, we are going to true in the waistline. So at this point, rather than pinning on the waistline, we will pin above the waistline. Now that the front and the back are pinned together, we will true in the complete waistline. We did not true the front waistline previous to this because it's preferable to do both the front and back at the same time. However, now, in order to clear the area for truing, we want to move the pins up and away from the side seam and the front darts. And now, in doing so, we must evaluate the markings of the waistline and how they relate to each other. You'll notice that on the side darts of both front and back, the cross marks don't quite fall in line with each other. They are a bit off. In the front it's a scant eighth, and in the back it's a scant 16th. When that happens, it's wise to compromise the problem and work for the point in between. using your curves, French curve at this point, some people may prefer to use the hip, whichever is most comfortable, we will draw a line connecting front dart, center dot on the back and center dot on the front, blending according to the dots that you marked on the figure. You'll notice that the back is curved a bit more than the front. And the blending requires a bit more care. Okay, now from the center darts on front and back, you will follow to the dot, and then from the dot, follow the cross grain towards the center. So that what you will achieve will be a right angle intersection of the waistline and the center seams. Having finished the waistline, bring your pins back to the waistline seam. Add 1-inch seam allowance. Cut the extra. And one more step to complete the skirt before pinning back on the form is the marking of the hem. Now, we know that this is a balanced skirt, cross grain parallel to the floor. Well, in a case like that, for a tentative hem, we may mark in the hemline 2 inches from above the cross grain for a hem notation. Now, I say tentative because all hems, all final hems, must be marked from the floor up. But at this point, to get a view of the skirt and a good feeling, good understanding of what it looks like, we will turn the hem under two inches from the bottom, which we allowed for when we were blocking our muslin. The skirt is now ready to be put back on the form for final checkout and fitting. pick up the pinches once again before evaluating fit. Place the seam at the point that you had originally marked in order to get an accurate determination of the draping procedure. Now this pinch seems to be pulling over. The pinch does not have to be on that grain line. It can be moved over if that's the way it should be fitted on the form. And again, I point out to you the ease that occurs in the back is accepted and considered appropriate to the fit of the garment. The skirt is now complete.